By now, we all know the story of the infamous weight joke that Ralph allegedly told about John Sacrimoni's wife, Ginny. Ralph said what he said at a birthday party for Albert. Little Paulie Germani attended the party, and while visiting his uncle Paulie in jail, he plays telephone literally by telling his uncle through the telephone about the joke. And while in jail, Paulie becomes close with John Sacrimoni, thanks to Sacrimoni manipulating him to get information on Tony's HUD scam and Esplanade construction project. Sacrimoni then, of course, hears the joke from Paulie, then attacks Donnie Cafranza because of his affiliation with the April crew, which Ralph was a captain of. And at the end of all this, Ralph and John were so close to getting whacked, with both hits getting called off last minute. Later, John decides to accept Ralph's apology about the joke about his wife. We can see that this off-colored remark, as Carmine Lupertazzis called it, was so dragged on and theatrical throughout the few seasons that we saw the storyline take place. But what if the joke had never gotten out? What would have happened between the relationships with the Sopranos and Lupertazzis, the relationship that Tony had with Ralph and John, and the relationship between John and Ralph? This is the what if of the weight joke. Before we get started, be sure to click subscribe and click the bell to get notifications on all upcoming Sopranos content, and be sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. When the 4th episode of the 4th season of The Sopranos, titled The Wait, aired, audiences were certainly made aware of the John Sacrimoni and Ralph Cifaretto beef. As the episode before this, Christopher saw John discover the alleged joke about his beloved wife, Ginny. This is all due in part thanks to Paulie giving John a phone call while in jail. Despite Paulie not even repeating the remark to John, it was still enough information for John to get upset and start a mini war between the two families. And as we all know, this was the beginning of the end that came with this scenario. The episode starts off with John and Joe Peeps at a local bar, and while sharing a drink, John notices a New Jersey-made man in Donnie Cafranza laughing at the other end of the bar. John, of course, thinks he's laughing about the alleged joke about his wife Ginny, so John takes matters into his own hands and decides to beat up on Donnie as he was leaving the bar. John beat up on Donnie so bad that it's discovered later in the series that he suffered nerve damage. While there was already tension between the two families, thanks to Paulie secretly telling John about Tony flipping a property by the Esplanade for his HUD scam that he shared with Assemblyman Zellman, the discovery of the joke about Ginny only made matters worse and impacted the two families and the series' plot throughout the 4th season. To try and discover who told John about the joke, Tony and Ralph call John to try and get to the bottom of the scenario. While Tony says no apologies are to be said from Ralph, he unwillingly but not really blabs one out to John, even though he denies ever saying the off-colored remark. This phone call only makes matters worse between the two families, as John becomes increasingly angry towards Ralph and the situation. We watch John's retaliation towards the phone call is to sanction a hit on Ralph Cifaretto. While John certainly wants this potential hit approved by his boss Carmine, many involved in the situation believe Sacrimoni's anger and acts of resolution are a little unnecessary. Even if Sacrimoni is right or wrong, his actions seem way out of line for an off-colored remark about his wife's weight. As years ago, during the golden age of the Mafia, wives were considered off limits when it came to hits, and avenging their honor, like what Sacrimoni is trying to do here, was a normal thing. However, this wouldn't be the first time we saw Tony and members of his crew poke fun at Johnny's wife.
So fat, her blood type is ragu.
She's so fat she goes camping. The bears have to hide their food.
When Ginny hauls ass, she's got to make 2 trips.
2 guys can fuck her at the same time and still never meet.
Of course, there's nothing wrong with boys being boys poking fun at their friend's wife, and it's not like this is off limits or can even be controlled by John anyway. However, Carmine was unwilling to give John the green light on approving the whacking of Ralph, simply because of how good of an earner Ralph was for the Esplanade construction project and the supposed money he brought in with his Fernandez paving contract. And while Tony may say he doesn't like Ralph and is choosing to side with John during this situation, Tony is actually secretly torn between the two. But what if the two were to get whacked? What would have happened during the rest of the 4th season? As there's pros and cons to both Sacrimoni and Cifaretto potentially getting clipped. First, there's only one benefit of Ralph, and that is his earning capabilities. As we all know the type of earner Ralph is. He puts millions of dollars into the pockets of New Jersey and New York. And as we've heard Carmine repeatedly say during this situation, there's millions of dollars at stake when it came to the joke about Ginny Sacrimoni. But with Ralph comes plenty of negatives, whether it's the off-colored remarks, his brief addiction to cocaine, his decision-making on not to think situations through, being a bad influence for Jackie Jr. by being the cause of his death, killing Tracy, or eventually learning about Ralph burning Pyomai alive, are all certainly negatives about the infamous character of Ralph. At times, it seems all these conflicts that Ralph has brought to the table get swept under the rug simply due to his ability to provide for both families. If John were to have gotten whacked, of course Tony would have lost a dear friend and a business partner. But ever since John decided to move to New Jersey without even telling Tony, he's caused nothing but headaches for Tony. His move to the Garden State almost acts as a way of John keeping an eye on Tony. And we also watched him get secretly close with one of Tony's guys in Paulie, as he manipulated him in return for information about Tony's crew and lucrative business deals that he wasn't sharing with New York, as we all know. And just like how John wrote it up, his plan to manipulate Paulie worked wonders, as he and Carmine eventually found out about Tony's HUD scam and were given shares of the profit from Tony. And it's during the sit down to discuss repairing the beef between Ralph and John where Tony basically should have had the higher hand, as he is totally right. Someone in his family is flapping their gums to New York and John isn't allowed to say who. This itself is technically the bigger beef than the alleged joke about Ginny. And we see during this sit down that Junior confirms this as well. So if John were to get whacked, it would result in less headaches for Tony and more money in his pockets. As it wasn't far after this entire situation that John was constantly nagging Tony about going along on taking out Carmine. And if Ralph were to get whacked, it would mean less headaches for Tony to deal with and certainly less money in his pocket. But later on during this fiasco, John takes matters into his own hands and decides to hire a hitman to go down to Miami and whack Ralph once and for all. But shockingly, the hit is called off last minute, with Ralph scarcely escaping death. Towards the end of the episode, we see that John decides to accept Ralph's apology regarding the joke about his wife. But what if there weren't any potential hits to begin with? What if this entire joke scenario was just like any other joke that we see throughout the series and no one ever cared? Well, for starters, Tony and his crew would likely have continued their success of flipping houses with HUD and Assemblyman Zellman. So with this, they would all have more money in their pockets. The relationship with John and Carmine would have been totally different as well. It's the Ginny Sacrimoni beef that was the final straw for John when it came to his relationship with Carmine, as he never backed up John during the situation, and Tony knew that this very decision that Carmine made was a mistake. This evidently left a sour taste in the mouth of John and was the conclusion for John to have Carmine whacked. The relationships between Tony and John, the Sopranos and the Lupertazzis, and Tony and Ralph would all have been different as well, as the joke about Ginny Sacrimoni was dragged on throughout the 4th season, taking up half the season's storyline. Tony's relationship with all of these individuals would have gone back to normality, dinners would have been the same, the Esplanade construction project would have continued to put money into the pockets of both families, and Ralph would have likely continued to be an immense earner despite his flaws. Looking back on the Ginny Sacrimoni beef, the entire scenario is so stupid and so ridiculous. All of the guys at some point have made fun of Ginny Sacrimoni's weight. Even Paulie, who was loyal to John Sacrimoni. The joke itself affected many characters and their relationships throughout the entire series. What if Ralph never told the joke? None of this would have happened, or even if he did tell the joke, what if little Paulie never opened his mouth? If he never opened his mouth, John likely would have never heard about the joke to begin with. There's so many what ifs in this entire situation, but ultimately the problem lies with Polly, as Polly's the one who told the joke to John. Throughout the series, there are some times where mobsters' wives do come up in discussion, especially when Tony and Carmela go through their divorce. But it's never to this degree that we saw with the Ginny Sacrimoni controversy. What are your thoughts about the Ginny Sacrimoni joke? I would love to hear them down in the comment section below. For more Sopranos content, keep it locked here, right here on this channel.